So I'm going to try this without the microphone because I kind of like to walk around. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah.
And I'd like to invite you in advance to do this when I start talking too fast. I try to speak slowly, especially when speaking to an audience of non-native English speakers, but I have a hard time doing it. I come from the east coast of Canada where we tend to talk a little fast. The title of tonight's talk is all about broadcast television, digital broadcast television, but to be frank, I don't really care much about broadcast television. I don't watch a lot of TV. I find that I can often find better things to do on the internet when the TV's on. In fact, the only thing that keeps me in the TV room is the fact that my laptop works when I'm in there. But I'll tell you, the thing that worries me about television is that in the rubric of making television, making the world safe for television and television safe for the world, we're endangering some of the fundamental liberties that we enjoy. We're about to sell out the future of technology, the internet, free speech, due process, and competition in order to rescue television. And I think that's a really deadly and dangerous place to be in, and I'm hoping to talk to you tonight about some of the ways in which that's happening and how we can fight back. Your family arrangements, your private viewing choices, your freedom to make and use free and open source software are all in jeopardy because of a series of mandates that have been proposed around the world and in Europe to prevent people from making unauthorized use of television signals. What this is really about isn't copyright per se, although it's often characterized as copyright protection or a copyright issue. This is about a rewriting of the copyright bargain to encompass areas that have never been countenanced in copyright law, to cover areas of private use and of social contract that have never been within the rights of an author to determine or to set. This is a mechanism for bootstrapping a monopoly over who gets to copy one's works into a monopoly over who gets to design and deploy technologies capable of copying one's works and which features those technologies will be allowed to have in the end. The thing that worries me most about all of this is the impact that it's going to have on free and open source software. Free and open source software is like the proprietary software you've probably encountered, Microsoft Windows, Apple's Mail client, the early versions of Netscape, and so on. Those technologies are like free and open source software, but the difference between them and free and open source software is that in the case of free and open source software, the code necessary to make those programs is published. And it's published under a license that allows anyone else to take that code and modify it and understand it and improve upon it and publish it again. Now, if that sounds familiar, it's because it's the thing that bootstrapped us out of the Dark Ages and got us the Enlightenment. For 500 years, there were no chemists, there were alchemists. Alchemists were a kind of precursor to scientists who were attempting to turn lead into gold and to understand more about the physical universe. And the thing that characterized alchemists more than anything was that alchemists didn't tell each other what they'd discovered. And so for 500 years, every alchemist discovered for himself, the hard way, that drinking mercury was a bad idea. And then one alchemist began to publish his research, and then another, and then another. And in 100 years, we had the Enlightenment that outstripped 5 centuries worth of progress by the simple expedient of telling people what you'd learned and allowing them to build on what you'd done. If you see farther, it's because you stand on the shoulders of giants, as Newton said. Digital rights management technologies, the technologies that are being used to lock down digital television and devices that can connect to digital television, like computers, is not science. It's based on the idea that the owner of a computer or the owner of a television is the attacker of that television, and that you can somehow prevent the person who owns the device from gaining access to it in ways that you would prefer they didn't get access to it. For example, you can flag a show so that it can't be recorded, it can only be watched. And you can somehow prevent the recording device in my living room from recording the show. Well, it's kind of like saying we built a safe that's so secure that we've left it in the bank robber's living room. Right? If the attacker has physical, permanent, unlimited access to the safe, it's a surety that eventually the technology will be broken. And of course, the people who propose these technologies agree with this. They say, well, this isn't meant to be proof against a skilled attacker, someone who really understands what he's about, someone who's in possession of the tools necessary to open a safe, someone who has a blowtorch and some dynamite. This is meant to be proof against you and me, against average individuals who wouldn't know how to break open a safe, even if it were sitting right there at the end of your sofa. But the thing is that in order to gain access to works that have been locked away in a safe somewhere, in the age of the internet, you don't need to know how to open the safe. You only need to know how to search the internet for the copy that someone else has taken out of some other safe somewhere in the world and put online, right? Which means that you don't have to be a skilled attacker to gain access to these works. You only have to be a skilled attacker to make the first copy of these works. So as a system for preventing people from making unlimited reuse of these works, DRM fails. What DRM succeeds at is at locking us into technologies so that we have to continue buying them forever, and locking us out of uses that we're allowed to make under copyright law. So copyright law is generally considered to be a bargain between authors or creators and the public. Authors get some exclusive rights in respect of their works, and all the rights that authors don't get, the public gets. So for example, I sell you a book, and I get the right to tell you whether or not you're allowed to photocopy that book and sell it on a blanket outside the main station. I get the right to tell you whether you can make a film out of that book. I get the right to tell you all kinds of things about that book, but I can't tell you, for example, what country you're allowed to read that book in. I can't tell you whether or not you're allowed to read that book to your children. And if you're blind, in most of the world, I'm not allowed to tell you whether or not you're allowed to convert that book to Braille or text so that it can be converted to speech subsequently. Most of the world, blind people have the unlimited right to transcode books into assistive formats. What DRM does is it allows rights holders to invent new rights that aren't in the copyright statutes that they can claim for themselves. So if you've ever brought a DVD home from America or from Asia and popped it into a DVD player in Europe, one that hasn't been illegally modified to allow you to watch multi-region DVDs, you'll find that a rights holder has invented a new law. That law is that, having sold you the DVD, they get to tell you what country you're allowed to watch the DVD in. That's not a law in copyright. That's not part of the copyright bargain. But what DRM does is it allows people to invent business models through which they can get more money out of the people who choose not to download their media from the internet through unauthorized services. So keep in mind, the only people who ever encounter DRM are the people who start off by saying, well, I'm not going to download this over BitTorrent. I won't get a copy of this from Kazaa. I'm going to go to the high street and I'll buy it from a Tower Records. Right? Those are the people who get CDs that are restricted, who get movies that are restricted. Those are the people who find themselves locked in. DRM is not a contract. We often hear DRM being characterized as a contract. And what they say is DRM may take away some of the rights that copyright law gives you, but it's in consideration for some benefit. Right? Surely we should all be allowed to freely contract to waive some of our rights to get some new rights back. Maybe you agree only to rent this movie, and so you agree to wrap it in a DRM wrapper that will erase the movie when you're finished watching it, or after a short period of time. When you actually examine the functioning of the DRM contract, you find that it resembles no contract that we're accustomed to in the real world. For example, I was at a DRM standards body meeting with a representative from the Motion Picture Association of America. And we were discussing whether or not a flag could be inserted into digital television in Europe that would allow your TV, your receiver, to switch off certain outputs depending on which program you were watching. So in other words, it would say, while you're watching this show, the output that connects to your DVD recorder won't work. Or to your old-style analog TV set or old-style analog VCR won't work. Or certain other devices might not work. Say the output that connects to your computer wouldn't work. Show on show, depending on which show you're watching. And I said, well, how would that work? And he said, well, maybe you would waive your right to record a show or to watch it on this set or to tune it in using this piece of your home theater equipment in exchange for consideration, in exchange for the right to watch the show. You'd enter into that bargain. And shouldn't people have the right to enter into a bargain like that? And I said, well, yeah, sure, maybe we could enter into those kinds of bargains. Can you tell me how we'd make a bargain like that? How that bargain would work? What would be the mechanism by which I'd agree to that contract? And he said, well, you'd be watching Channel 3, and you'd take your remote, and you'd press Channel Up, and now you'd be watching Channel 4. And when you pressed Channel Up, you agreed to whatever terms were set for Channel 4. You made an agreement. Right? It's a funny kind of agreement. It's the kind of agreement you might find if you walked into a shop and the shopkeeper punched you in the mouth. And you said, why did you punch me in the mouth? And he said, well, if you look under the doormat of another shop, you'll find that it says, people who enter my shop agree to let me punch them in the mouth. It's a funny kind of agreement, but it gets funnier. If you bought some iTunes a couple of years ago, when iTunes was up to version 4.0, you got a bunch of rights with those iTunes. You got the right, for example, to stream your music from one computer to another. Now, at the time, I was living in San Francisco and working for Electronic Frontier Foundation. I should point out that I'm actually retired from EFF. I'm a full-time novelist now, although I'm a fellow of the organization, as of January 1st. So I had a computer at home, and I had a laptop that I took to work. And the computer at home had a much bigger hard drive than my laptop, and so I kept all my music on that, including all my iTunes. And the cool thing was that iTunes 4.0 had the ability to stream music from one computer to another. Right? So I used it to listen to my home music while I was at work. It was great. Now, when Apple shipped iTunes 4.01, the next update, which was supposed to improve functionality, it clawed that feature back. And in fact, time and time again, Apple has clawed back new features. At one point, you could stream your music to any 5 people that you wanted, 5 people at a time, as many as you wanted per 24-hour period. Now you can only stream to 5 people total per 24-hour period. At one point, you could burn a playlist 10 times, now it's 7 times, and so on and so forth. These changes have been made time and again, and they're generally presented to you as non-optional or semi-optional updates to iTunes, generally with very small amounts of consumer information about what you're losing. Now, if you took your car to the garage for its regular checkup, as mandated by the manufacturer, and when you took it out again, you found that they'd taken out your phone charger, ripped it out, and replaced it with a new lighter arrangement that wouldn't take your phone charger anymore, because while you'd had it in the garage, they'd made a new deal with Nokia to block out Sony Ericsson phones, I think you'd be very upset. But what we find is with our music and our movies and our books, that our software, our tools are being updated time and again to claw back rights. Now, it's not a big deal if it's a car, because there's someone else who can fix your car. And if the manufacturer upsets you enough, you can always go somewhere else and get your car fixed. And certainly you can always imagine that someone out there will figure out a way to plug something new into your car's cigarette lighter. But with DRM, we have laws that make it unlawful to do just that. We have anti-circumvention laws that are embodied in Europe through the EUCD, the European Union Copyright Directive, and in America through the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, and all around the world through laws that accede to a WIPO treaty, an UMPI treaty called the WIPO Copyright Treaty of 1996, or WCT. That's all over the world. Every country that's got electricity pretty much either has a WCT implementation or is about to get one, usually through as a condition of bilateral or multilateral trade arrangements with the EU or America or both. And under these laws, it's unlawful to break a lock off of a piece of media. It's unlawful to tell someone how to break a lock off of a piece of media. It's unlawful to tell someone who they should ask, who might be able to tell them how to break a lock off of a piece of media. So you have Jan Johansson, a Norwegian teenager, who spent years in court before his country adopted the EUCD, spent years in court fighting over a law, or fighting over a charge, rather, that he had broken the law because he had gone into his own computer to look at how his own movie player worked and open up that movie player and make a new movie player that would let him watch his own movies on his own computer in the way of his choice, and had told other people how to do this. They said essentially that he was guilty of unlawfully accessing a computer system, and when he asked which computer system he'd unlawfully accessed, they said it was his own. So it's fine if your manufacturer wants to engage in these terrible anti-competitive practices if you can go to another manufacturer. It's fine if the guy who makes your stereo turns out to be a jerk, if you can play your CDs on someone else's stereo. But when it comes to DRM, you can only play your DRM on the stereo provided by the DRM provider. You can't play on someone else's stereo. And someone who makes a stereo that'll play it, that person breaks the law. Apple sued Real Media when they made a compatible player for the iPod that would play real music, real tunes music, as well as iTunes music on the iPod. DRM is not a contract in some other ways. Contracts, even if you say that we can agree to these contracts, these strange and abusive contracts, generally speaking, we say that having agreed to them, we finalize them. But as we see with iTunes, and more recently in the US, there was a case where TiVo was updated without people's permission. So this is a digital TV recorder that records your favorite TV shows and stores them on a box that sits under your television. TiVo was updated without your permission, without your knowledge, to include a new copy restriction system called Macrovision. And what Macrovision lets program creators do and program broadcasters do is flag some shows as not recordable. And so the TiVo, when you set it to record certain shows, it won't record them if they have this flag set. So when you bought your TiVo, you got a device that would record everything on the air. And then a month later, they changed your TiVo so that it would record everything on the air that wasn't flagged as not recordable. Your VCR will still record those shows. The law lets you record those shows. But your TiVo won't let you record those shows. Finally, DRM can't be open source. Open source technologies are technologies that are designed to be understood, modified, improved upon by their users, by their owners. The Linux operating system, the Firefox browser, innumerable other pieces of critical infrastructure that make up the internet and your desktop are built on free and open source software. DRM presumes that the owner of the computer, that the user of the computer is the attacker, and that the user and owner of the computer shouldn't be able to change the computer to change the restrictions. If you get a piece of media that says this media may be played on 5 computers, the owner of the computer shouldn't be able to go in and change that to 15. But in the instance of free and open source software, you can, in fact, go in and change it to 15. And as a consequence, you see in the licensing arrangements and regulatory mandates for DRM, there's always a requirement that these systems be made resistant to user modification, which is to say, not open source. Now, underway in Europe is a proposal for a sweeping DRM system that will touch digital television and everything that sits downstream from digital television, including personal computers, general purpose devices, and special purpose devices, things like the iPod. The DRM proposal is something called CPCM, Copy Protection Content Management, and it comes from a standards body group called the Digital Video Broadcasters Forum, or DVB. DVB specifies the standards for use in digital television in Europe, Asia, Australia, parts of Latin America. And it's often the case that a DVB standard is the subject of a mandate, of a law, because it's often considered by regulators to be in the public interest to require that everyone who builds a digital television receiver or transmitter build it to some specification so that you can be sure that when you turn on your TV, you can receive the TV broadcast. After all, it's your airwaves and mine that are used by broadcasters to transmit. They take them in trust from us, and we should be able to see what they transmit over our electromagnetic spectrum. So you have regulatory mandates for digital television being the norm, and you have the Digital Television Standards Body creating a DRM standard that will be part of the digital television standard. When you put these two things together, you have a 16-car pileup on the motorway. You have a terrible disaster in the offing, which is a mandate for DRM. So let's talk a little bit about what DVB is and how CPCM works. DVB is a private industry consortium. It costs 10,000 euros a year to be a member. You have to be either a manufacturer or an academic or a broadcaster or a cinema, a film company to join. EFF is a member. My former employer is a member. We represent a manufacturer, an open source manufacturer called GNU Radio there. And the meetings are subject to a kind of non-disclosure agreement. So you can't really talk about what's said in the meetings until DVB decides to go public with it. This is essentially a secret lawmaking process. that's underway there. Now, when we're talking about technical standards, it's not such a big deal, but as soon as we start talking about sweeping restrictions, changes to the way that the copyright bargain works, it becomes very grave indeed. Warner Brothers, who are well represented there, the representative from Warner Brothers is also the chairman of the compliance ad hoc group in the DVB CPCM group, gave a presentation last year in March in Dublin at the DVB World Public Conference, in which they promised that they would see regulatory mandates across Europe forcing CPCM, and that these would mirror the regulatory mandates that forced the broadcast flag in America. This was a proposal that said people who build digital television technologies should first get the permission of the entertainment industry for all the features that those technologies would have. Now remember, in 1976 through 1984, the movie studios claimed that the VCR would put them out of business, and they sued and they lobbied very hard to get the VCR prevented from being introduced into the market. In fact, in 1982, Jack Valenti, the mouthpiece for the Motion Picture Association, went to a congressional hearing at UCLA and said that the VCR is to the American film industry as the Boston Strangler is to a woman home alone, who's a serial killer, and promised that this would be the death knell of his industry. And at his exit interview just a couple of years ago when he retired, he said he never regretted a word of it, that he still believes that the VCR is dangerous to the entertainment industry and should be banned, and that the brand new Motion Picture Association of America building in Washington, D.C. is called the Jack Valenti Building. This is not an industry that is in any position to tell us which features should and shouldn't be allowed in digital television. What CPCM does is specify a wide range of restrictive flags that can be set for digital television programs, and a compliance regime that manufacturers will have to adhere to in order to be in compliance with the standard. And that compliance regime basically says what they have to do when they meet these flags and how they have to design their technology. Now, I'll talk a little about the specific restrictions, but those aren't the important pieces here. The important piece here is that we are moving from a world, potentially, where the thing that determines whether or not your device is allowed in the market and succeeds is whether or not customers want it and are willing to spend money on it, to a world where the thing that determines whether your device is allowed in the market is whether or not an entertainment industry executive says it should be. We're moving to a world where the person who makes the record gets to design the record player. Moreover, because the compliance regime specifies that everything in the technology has to be resistant to user modification, we will have for the first time a strong motivation for the companies that make technology components like hard drives, video cards, tuner cards, and so on. Will have a strong motivation for those people to design their devices so that users can't modify them, so that open source drivers can't be written for them. So the entire PC ecosystem starts to ripple from this as we see manufacturers building their tuner cards, their video cards, their hard drives, and so on to resist free and open source software, because they're afraid that should these components end up with free and open source drivers, that they will no longer be useful or lawful for use with television technologies. And finally, as digital television migrates to the PC, this starts to put PCs in the realm of a regulator. We suddenly go from a regulator doing nothing but assuring themselves that a TV works as it's advertised to assuring themselves that PCs are programmed and designed in a way to protect the entertainment industry's business model. It suddenly becomes incumbent upon technology makers who make general purpose technologies to assure themselves that what they build doesn't unduly disrupt some other industry's business models. The restrictions themselves are, in fact, quite scary for all of that. The thing that gets me most is something called authorized domain. The idea of authorized domain is the idea that you can flag a piece of content so that it can only be consumed by devices owned by a single household. It sounds reasonable enough on the surface, but it raises this question: what's a household? Right? If you're from a diaspora family, where part of your family is in the developing world and part of your family is here in the developed world, maybe working as a day laborer or as an au pair, are you part of the kind of family that this system will recognize? Is it likely that these engineers meeting in closed-door meetings in smoke-filled rooms at the EBU in Geneva have countenanced that sort of family arrangement? Can they design a computer technology that can distinguish between a family with far-flung members all over the world and a family that, and just a group of people who are sharing media indiscriminately, can they distinguish between a situation in which a bunch of neighbors who aren't part of the same household and all live on the same floor of an apartment building are trying to share media, and a situation in which a communal household emerges, like when you put your father in an old folks' home and he wants to take his media with him when he checks in? Can they distinguish between the person who goes from house to house sharing his content and the child of a divorced couple who goes back and forth once a week per her custody arrangement and tries to share their media? Now, I've raised this question, and they said, well, we've solved this problem in other fora. We have, for example, Windows XP activation. Sometimes you try to activate a copy of Windows XP, and it looks like you're trying to do something dodgy, and XP says, call this number to confirm that what you're doing isn't dodgy. Well, that's fine when you're buying a copy of Windows. But since when does watching television require that you ring up a call center and explain the circumstances of your parents' divorce? I think it's a terrible thing to expand the copyright monopoly into. It's one thing to say I get to say who gets to copy my books. It's another thing for me to say I get to tell you what your family is allowed to consist of. There are other areas in which we'll see restrictions, more kind of easily understood restrictions. The number of screens that a show is allowed to be on, the duration that you're allowed to store a show for, the number of viewings you're allowed to have, and how far away from the receiver your screen is allowed to be. Today you can buy simple devices. Do you have SCART in Brussels, or is that just a UK thing? You can buy simple SCART devices that will wirelessly transmit your SCART signal from one room to the other. I do this at home. I've got a SCART, a cable box in one room, and on another floor I've got a television, and I wirelessly retransmit it rather than stringing a wire up through the floor. Now, when you hear the standards body people talk about this, the entertainment industry people talk about this, what they say is that watching a show that's being received in one room while you're sitting in another room has value. And if it has value, we should be able to charge money for it. Right? Siva Vaidyanathan, who wrote The Anarchist in the Library, NYU professor, calls this the if value then right theory. Right? If there's some value to something, someone must have a right to that value. Well, they're correct. There is value to being able to watch a show that's being received in one room while you're sitting in another room. We can measure that value. It's the price that I'm willing to spend on the wireless device that retransmits it from one place to another. What this standard proposes to do, what this law proposes to do, is expropriate that value from you and me, with whom it currently vests, and to give it to the entertainment industry, who can then sell it back to us. They characterize this as a new business model. That's kind of an internet-ready business model for this. And I call it the urinary tract infection business model. Right? It used to be that you could sit in your living room and there were a million things you could do freely and easily. You could change the channel, you could pause, you could rewind, you could plug in more screens, take fewer screens, you could watch a show in one room that was being received in another room. It was all very free and easy. And now, every button on your remote has a price tag. It comes in slow, painful drips. Right? It's not a business model that I want to be a customer of. So, every government in Europe is trying to figure out how to create a digital television transition, how to convince people like you and me to buy digital televisions or digital television receivers and get rid of our analog televisions. There's a pretty good reason for this. Right now, every government in Europe is broadcasting, has set up broadcast licenses to broadcast the same shows in two different ways. One is analog, one is digital. The spectrum that's being used for analog television transmission could be reclaimed, used for mobile phones, used for unlicensed wireless, auctioned and sold off to taxi drivers, and there are innumerable ways that that value could be reclaimed, and certainly not in the public interest to have all of this prime spectral real estate, this electromagnetic real estate, sitting out there fallow. It'd be great if we could get people to buy and use digital televisions. The entertainment industry's story, again and again, is if we can give people good enough TV shows that are ready for digital, that they'll go out and they'll buy digital televisions. That what people want is high-quality content. Now, as a technical matter, that doesn't seem to be working, and this is what they've pursued in America, and it's just not a big winner. America's really lagging the digital television transition. In the UK, they've tried something else. In the UK, what they've tried doing is giving people free TV. That turns out to be very successful. What they've done is they're multiplexing, that is to say, putting lots of shows in one signal. They're multiplexing 3 or 4 standard definition shows in every one of those high definition channels. and then they're selling Freeview boxes for £70 or even less. And these Freeview boxes give you 30 free channels of television and 20 free channels of audio forever. You buy one box and you never have to pay a cable bill again. Unsurprisingly, that has convinced a lot of people to buy digital television boxes and to get rid of their analog sets. In America, we killed the broadcast flag. We killed it in a couple of ways, but the key insight that we had that made the broadcast flag go away in America is that no lawmaker wants to be remembered as the elected representative who killed television, right? Who broke her constituents' televisions. There's no surer way to convince Americans to vote for someone else than to screw up their TVs. That seems to be a truism that lawmakers have taken to heart. So when the broadcast flag was proposed, the initial idea was that a lawmaker from Louisiana, a guy named Billy Tozan, would make a law that would require the Federal Communications Commission, which is the regulator, to enact the broadcast flag regulation. It would give them this explicit jurisdiction to become kind of kings of devices and regulators of device characteristics. Now, as we made a bigger and bigger stink about what was happening at the broadcast flag, this lawmaker's enthusiasm for making this law got smaller and smaller and smaller. And eventually, when they delivered their report, which consisted of 20 pages of recommendations and 200 pages of objections, this lawmaker got cold feet and said, I'm not going to make a law. Instead, he sent a letter to the commissioner of the FCC saying, I think you've already got the jurisdiction. You don't need my help. Go ahead and make the regulation without me. I'm not going to be the lawmaker who broke my constituents' TVs. And the FCC did indeed make this regulation. Being regulators, they're less concerned with what voters think of them. They know that they'll be out when the next party takes office, and that they'll move into a position in industry. So they went ahead and they enacted this regulation. But what came as a consequence of enacting this regulation was that we were able to sue to ask the courts to determine whether or not they actually had this jurisdiction. And the courts, unsurprisingly, said, no, they don't. We don't let the broadcast regulator tell you how you can design your PC. That's not what they're there for. If you guys want to make this kind of regulation, you've got to go and get a law made in support of it. Now, the studios had a hard time finding a lawmaker who was willing to make that kind of law. And so what we saw was a lot of very sneaky lawmaking, a lot of people tacking on the broadcast flag law to the end of a budget balancing bill. And we just kept a very close eye on this stuff. And we sent lots and lots of letters from lots and lots of people to lawmakers, voters, to lawmakers saying, we see what you're up to. We don't like it. And over again, these things just kept getting withdrawn. And the latest rendition of this is playing out this week. In the Senate, they've just introduced the Digital Content Protection Act, the DCPA. This suicidal senator has introduced it. It contains the broadcast flag. It contains the broadcast flag for radio. And it governs the characteristics of any device that can receive a signal after it's been received by a radio or television. So that is to say, your iPod suddenly becomes the subject of regulation as well. It's a pretty amazing idea. And again, I think we're going to win. In order to win this fight in Europe, we need to get involved with domestic European civil liberties organizations, as well as Electronic Frontier Foundation, which has a presence here in Europe and does some activism here in Europe. As you've heard, I spent 2 years here working on this. There's now another guy who's working on this digital television stuff. But there's also a lot of Made in Europe organizations. There's Creative Commons Brussels. There's Bits of Freedom in the Netherlands. There's the Chaos Computer Club in Germany. There's ORG in the UK. There's Digital Ireland in Ireland. And everywhere you go in Europe, you see these digital liberties movements cropping up, these digital rights groups cropping up. And it's because what's happened is all of the stuff that used to matter in the real world has started to matter online as well. The more time we spend online, the more vital our interactions become online, the more incursions into our online liberties start to matter as much as our incursions into our offline liberties, and the more we see people congregating around these issues. Bits are never going to get harder to copy, ever. We are at this moment experiencing the hardest bits will ever be to copy for the rest of time. Bits are only going to get easier to copy from here on in. If there is a business that relies on its bits not being copied, that business will either have to change or die. Every year we hear about how there are fewer CDs being sold, or fewer books being sold, or fewer other packages that are traditionally used to deliver bits being sold. And it's unsurprising. It would be surprising if it were the inverse. CD sales are never going to go up again, in the same way that oat bag and horseshoe sales will never go up again. Right? We've stabilized the amount of horseshoes and oat bags that will be sold year on year, and we'll shortly stabilize the number of CDs, and we'll sell them like oil paintings to a very small number of people who are interested in acquiring them. But we've reached the end of the lifespan for platters that deliver bits. Bits are here to be copied, and bits will continue to be copied, and business models need to start embracing copying. I've done that with my own work. My first novel, Down and Out in the Magic Kingdom, was released just over 3 years ago on January 9th, 2003. It was the first novel released under what's called a Creative Commons license. These are licenses that encourage people to non-commercially share works. I released it then because I realized that as a novelist, my biggest threat to my livelihood wasn't piracy, it was obscurity. Of all the people who were potential customers for my books, the reason that the main number of them would fail to buy them wasn't that someone had given them a free electronic copy. It was that they'd never heard of it. And by making my books available electronically, they were able to spread a lot further. And I've done this now with 3 novels and a short story collection. My first book has been downloaded now 650,000 times from my website, and an untold number of times from other people's websites. And it's in its 6th physical printing. It's just come out in Spain, it's coming out in Japan, there's a French edition coming, and so on. Giving the book away has sold lots more copies. Right? I've found a copy-friendly business model, and it's a different business model from the one that we've had before. Now, it's true, I think, that eventually we'll reach a point where electronic books don't sell print books, where instead of being a complementary good, where having the print book and the electronic book at the same time makes the print book more valuable and the electronic book more valuable. I think we'll reach a point where having the electronic book is all that you really want in the main. That'll be the convergence of 2 things. One is the fact that screens are getting better, and the other is that we're getting less discriminating about what we read off of screens. We have a generation of people who spend every hour they can find reading off of screens. Those people will always be comfortable reading off of screens. And if there's a literary form or a narrative form that doesn't lend itself to screens, those people just won't consume it. Right? The consumer base for that kind of work will just dwindle away if it's not screen native. And I feel like I've got to figure out now what the business model is going to be then. I've got to make hay while the sun is shining. I've got to give away books to sell books today, but also give away books to figure out how to sell books tomorrow, when physical books are no longer things that people are really willing to spend a lot of money on. And the way to do that is by watching what people do when you give them electronic text. It's this nice confluence of the thing that sells books today and the thing that will sell books tomorrow. I don't think you can learn anything about how people will use digital media by giving it to them in restricted wrappers. If you give someone a book in a restricted wrapper, all that they can do with it is the stuff that you thought of. They'll never surprise you. So those of you who are engaged in avid copying, and if you're an internet user, there's at least a 50% chance that you're engaged in very avid copying. It may feel sometimes like what you're doing is illegal, immoral, or contributing to the downfall of society. And it's quite possible that what you're doing is illegal. It's unsurprising to hear that copyright law hasn't kept pace with technology. After all copyright law is a regulatory system for copying and distributing works. These are technological activities. And if you sat down as a lawmaker and tried to imagine every possible thing you might someday do with a work before writing your law and making sure that all things were countenanced and included in the law, you'd never finish writing. The law would never ship. So of course, new uses aren't imagined in old laws. But what you're doing is something that's endemic to a world of bits. What you're doing when you copy is something that everyone will be doing shortly, and that businesses that can't survive in the face of it will fade away as a result of it. Right? It may be that traffic laws didn't allow for automobiles or horseless carriages or iron horses, the locomotive, when they were invented. It may be that the laws invented for horse and buggies didn't countenance those, and it may be that everyone who went about in one of those was breaking the law technically. But the outcome was a system that legalized those, was a system that embraced those, wasn't a system that sought to find a way to ensure that horseshoes would always be sold by requiring 4 horseshoes per horsepower in the locomotive to be welded to the engine. So that's what I've got to say to you tonight. I really appreciate your patience, and I'd be really happy to take any questions you have. Thank you. Have we got time for questions?
So we have 5 minutes more or less, because as I said, what we propose to be on time for the people working here, because Brazil is a kind of long feature film. We take also questions outside, because I think the journalists also agree that we can assist the interviews and make some questions. So let's take one or two here inside. Someone? Somewhere?
It was all totally self-explanatory and uncontroversial.
Yeah. What do you think when
someone ask?
other people can
Sorry.
This person, then when you? Yeah.
What you tell us is that there are business models who can live with free copying. Why not, I mean, then the question could come up, why not let people compete? Why not let business models compete? You have people who will choose to distribute their works protected with DRM techniques, and you will have people like you who choose, well, it's more important for me to get known, so let people copy my content. It's a way of marketing for myself, and I'll compensate that by, for example, giving lectures, performances as a musician, and so on.
I propose to ban DRM. I don't think it should be unlawful. I just think it's a bad idea, and I think that one of the ways that markets work is when people who think that a product or service is substandard, they go around and they tell other people about it, and then people who are potential purchasers of those technologies make an informed decision. I think, though, that there's a real risk in today's world that if you don't have a DRM wrapper, you won't be able to play. For example, if you want to distribute through the iTunes Music Store, you have to have DRM. You don't get to choose to take it off. So I agree with you completely. I think that it would be great to see an open and level playing field, and I certainly don't think that we should make DRM illegal, but I don't think we should mandate it in the law. So in other words, if the studios could convince TV manufacturers to voluntarily put DRM in their TVs, if they could somehow convince them that there were customers for DRM who would buy TVs because they want a way to do less with their media, then I think that they should be able to do that. What I don't think they should be able to do is bootstrap the copyright monopoly into a regulation requiring people to build televisions to their specifications.
Yeah, two questions. The first one is, you spoke just briefly about how our existences are going from the offline world to the online world. Well, in the offline world, there are many things that protect the rights of human beings. We have declarations, we have laws that have been ingrained for many years. What sort of lessons can we learn from those offline human rights laws to inform an online digital human rights law? The second thing is, in an age of globalization, we have a globalized internet. Yet at the same time, in terms of my national citizenry or where I live, I choose to live in the Netherlands even though I'm from Canada, the East Coast as well. What happens when we have a globalized internet? Will there be countries that you can migrate to, or are you compelled to live on the same global nation as the rest of the internet?
Well, I think that there are two forces at work in respect to the internet. One is, and globalization. One, as you say, is that the internet is everywhere, and it's hard to be an expat, to be as expat as an expat might have been a few decades ago, where you're just sort of severed away. I don't know about you. I was up half the night watching the CBC election results from Toronto last night.
What did you vote for?
I voted for Peggy Nash, the NDP. I voted against Sam Bolte. The Conservatives won. Minority government. They'll be out in 6 months. Vote of no confidence. You heard it here first. But the other thing that's happening is international treaties are harmonizing the industry-led regulations around the world. So we see the WTO as it moves around the world. It has accompanying it a suite of copyright, patent, and trademark rules called the TRIPS that every country that gets into the WTO is also signing on to, whether or not it's in their national interests. So I just came back from Uganda, where I was at an African Copyright Congress, and there were a lot of librarians and copyright regulators and distance educators there, and they'd found themselves bound by copyright laws that were designed and written in the developed world, and they weren't appropriate to their uses. They weren't appropriate to their needs. If you're in a country where all of the domestically produced works are government funded because there's no domestic publishing industry, and where distance education is the way that you're hoping to bootstrap yourself to developed status, then you might in fact make it lawful for people to copy works through university networks back and forth, especially if you don't have a print library, and especially if distance education is going to places where they don't have regular access to the mails and so on. But the TRIPS might prohibit that, and in fact the TRIPS does often prohibit that, particularly where we're talking about DRMs on works. So we're seeing a great collapse of choices for people. Now there's a movement afoot to reverse this trend, and this is through something called the Development Agenda at WIPO, at OMPI, which is a proposal to that Brazil and Argentina brought forward and that was ratified by the plenary to turn WIPO into the humanitarian agency that it promised it would be when it was given UN accreditation. And that is to say, to cause it to only make policies henceforth that have a humanitarian dimension. The proposal that we've brought to them through a large coalition of NGOs is something called the Access to Knowledge proposal. And that's a proposal for a treaty that would harmonize the rights of people who provide access to educators, archivists, and disabled people all around the world. Right now, those rights are different in every country. So there's the same rights for authors, but different rights for the public. So if you scan a page in Montreal and you send it to a colleague in Rwanda to be used, and it's in the public domain in Montreal, it might not be in the public domain in Rwanda, or it might not be fair dealing to send it on to France. And as a consequence, you can't collaborate across borders in these good works. And I think that we'll see more of that, and I'm hoping that we can use globalization to our advantage as well.
You mentioned that you've distributed your books electronically because by gaining increased awareness, you were able to then sell printed copies, and that won't be possible in the future.
Right.
So some form of copy protection is going to be needed, perhaps, in order in the future for you to be able to make some money on the novels that you write.
Well, no. Some form of protection is going to be needed in order for me to make money by selling copies of my novels. But that doesn't mean that that's how I'll make money off of my novels. You know, when vaudeville came along, or when radio came along rather, vaudeville artists protested. They said Marconi was a crook because he'd made it possible for people to take their performances and emit them over the airwaves, and that they couldn't charge admission to the airwaves. And they proposed that radio should be redesigned so they could charge admission to them. And anyone who's got a satellite radio, in fact, probably owns a radio you can charge admission to. But for most of a century, being able to receive a radio signal without paying an admission price actually made a lot of money for artists. It ended up expanding. By expanding the reach of music and by expanding who could play, it expanded the market for art and the compensation on offer to authors, to artists by orders of magnitude. So if you believe that there is such a thing as a DRM that will work, and I don't. I think if you look in the field, there's never been a DRM that works, and I think that's because if you put the safe in the bank robber's sitting room, the safe won't stay cracked very long. And inevitably you have to put the safe in the bank robber's sitting room, then then you're right. You know, if you believe DRM works, then probably a DRM system might be useful for selling books. But I don't think a DRM system will work. So I think we're going to have to come up with a business model as weird as the one that emerged for radio. The one that emerged for radio went like this. What we're going to do is we're going to get down-heels actors with good baritone voices to give testimonials to the value of soap. And then we're going to invent a new form of statistical math for auditing who's listening to radio broadcasts that we have no way of actually doing actual numbers on. And then we're going to petition the Congress for an exemption to the antitrust rules so that we can price fix music and do blanket licensing on it. And we're going to divvy up the money from the soap people to the people whose records we're playing using the new math under the aegis of the antitrust exemption, and we'll make 1,000 times more artists, 1,000 times more money. Right? Well, it was a ridiculous business model until it worked. And I think that on this side of the singularity, it was impossible to predict what it was going to look like. And on that side of the singularity, in hindsight, it seems inevitable. When you can't charge money for copies, you do something else. You find another way to support yourself. And you know, the artists of the day, a lot of them complained bitterly, even when it emerged that Marconi's business model would work for them. They complained because they said that they were charismatics. And they stood in front of an audience and they gave a performance. And that performance was an old and holy thing, as old as the first story told in front of the first fire in the first cave. And Marconi had no business relegating them to being mere clerks who would sit in a back room, and when they were done, they could hand it over to Marconi's licensors, who would then interact with their audience on their behalf. Now, 70 years later, a lot of people have observed that we live in an era where it's very hard to control the diffusion of a phonogram, but you can use that maybe to bring people into the house when you're giving a concert. And so therefore, if you give a good show and you have a good phonogram, you can sort of pack the house and you can earn a living that way. And today, the spiritual descendants of those people who said that they didn't want to become mere clerks say, well, what are you talking about? We're white-collar workers. We work indoors. We commune with our muse. And when we're done, we open the door to the studio and give it to you lot. We're not trained monkeys. You have no right to demand that we caper on stages. Why should we have to be charismatics in order to earn our living? Why shouldn't our virtuosity be sufficient unto itself? And I think the lesson is technology giveth and technology taketh away. But year on year, invention on invention, we find that each turn of technology enables more money to go to more artists who make more art that reaches a wider audience. The people who made sheet music hated records. The people who made records hated radio. People who made radio hated cable. The people who made cable hated the VCR. And the people who make VCRs hate the internet. Every pirate who goes up the ladder and puts on an admiral's hat wants to look down at the pirates who are trying to come up the ladder and kick them down the ladder and say, you guys are real pirates, right? I'm an admiral.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you all.